Thank you all for joining us today. Pamela, Starr, and Patrick Schaefer will be discussing the first 100 Days Memo on U.S. Mexico relations. Today, they will remark as though they are providing policy recommendations to President Biden and his cabinet. Please do keep this in mind when posing questions at the end. Please be sure to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. With that, I'm pleased to introduce Michael Comunez, President and CEO of Monarch Global Strategies, to kick us off.
Thank you, Ashley. Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. It's wonderful to be with you today as part of this terrific event. And thanks to the Pacific Council and all of you for your interest in and support of U.S. Mexico relations. Today's program is part of the Council's Mexico Initiative, which we launched a couple of years ago with the generous support of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and many of our members to elevate the Council's focus on the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and to support programming like this that calls attention to it. I'm proud to be both the director of the Council as well as the founding chair of the Mexico Initiative, and I want to thank and acknowledge the members of the Mexico Initiative Advisory Board, many of whom are on the call today, including Marianne Walker, our vice chair. I couldn't be more pleased to support today's event, which fulfills one of the initiative's commitments to put forward a first 100 days policy memo for the new administration. I was honored to contribute to the report as an interview subject and to offer my editorial suggestions as well, but the real credit goes to the report author, Ricardo Corona, and the Council staff who worked hard to bring the final report to life. I know that Pamela and Patrick will be providing some insightful comments in this innovative format, and I look forward to and encourage your active participation in the Q&A session which follows, which I'll also be participating in. I want to call to your attention a few upcoming events that will be occurring through the Pacific Council and through the Mexico Initiative to sustain our focus on U.S.-Mexico relations, including after this event on February 25th, there'll be an event on COVID-19 and its impact on the U.S.-Mexico border. And next month on March 15th, a very special event with former Deputy Secretary and former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Zoellick talking about the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the context of the broader North American relationship overall. Let me just conclude by affirming my own personal conviction that there's never been a more important time for the United States and Mexico to collaborate in a strategic manner, not just as neighbors, but as bona fide economic partners. As the Biden administration works to reestablish U.S. leadership globally, and to reopen the U.S. and global economies and to offer a uniquely American response to Chinese competitive pressures, there's no doubt that Mexico, together with Canada, will play an essential role in making North America the most competitive economic region and leader in the world. And it's only through this kind of collaboration that we can hope to compete effectively with the Chinese and others. And events like this and the recommendations they set forth are a critical part of that outcome. And as Pamela will mention in a moment, there's a uniquely special opportunity right now with the new administration to take advantage of that opportunity. So thank you for your interest and participation, and please join me now in welcoming our first presenter, my colleague at Monarch Global Strategies and a well-respected expert on Mexico in her own right at USC, Dr. Pamela Starr.
Thank you, Michael. As Michael said, actually, before I start, I want to also thank the Pacific Council for the opportunity to actually participate in some of the sessions that led to, that it formed part of this memo, but also the opportunity to talk to you today and present some of the main recommendations that the memo presents. What I'd like to do is three things. I'm first going to give a little bit of a background of the context of the relationship to emphasize, as Michael said, this window of opportunity that we have in the bilateral relationship. Then I want to talk about the importance of the strategic partner focusing in specifically on our policy recommendations. And then finally, looking at the public diplomacy elements of our recommendations. As everyone knows, it's unlike the Trump administration, which had a laser-like focus on trade and immigration. The Biden administration has a more complete agenda for the relationship with Mexico, including trade and immigration, of course, but also security, energy and climate change, and a wide range of border issues, and of course, public health matters in a global pandemic. While it is like there are going to be areas, there's likely going to be areas of real conflict in the bilateral relationship, including security relations, which are at their lowest ebb since the 1980s, but also energy and climate change, given Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's focus on an increasing energy independence at the hands of two state-owned energy companies and reliance on fossil fuels over renewables. There's still going to be a lot of room for collaboration. Much has been made of López Obrador's nationalist bent, his close relationship with Trump, and a series of actions that seemed hostile to the new Biden administration. For example, he delayed recognition of Biden's election victory until after the Electoral College vote, one of only 3 world leaders to do so, and his letter of congratulations was decidedly lukewarm. There was also an enormous security spat over Mexico's former defense minister, Salvador Cienfuegos, who was arrested on drug trafficking or drug-related, charges, and then extradited to Mexico, then exonerated, which led to a big problem in the bilateral relationship in conjunction with Mexican legislation that makes it harder for U.S. Personnel in Mexico to operate. All of these things gave the impression that Mexico really wanted problems. He wanted conflict with Biden. That being said, all that being said, López Obrador was careful to blame the entire security conflict on the Trump administration. And he's repeatedly called for a respectful and positive relationship with the Biden administration. Indeed, he understands that a good relationship with the United States is very important to Mexico and to his ability to carry out what he calls his 4th transformation suite of domestic policies, to which he's dedicated his entire political life. So there's a real window of opportunity at the outset of the Biden administration for our 2 countries to resolve bilateral conflicts and strengthen cross-border cooperation. Taking advantage of this opportunity, rehabilitating the U.S. Mexico security relationship and maintaining positive momentum on trade and migration policy and making progress on other bilateral issues will require deft diplomacy from the Biden administration. There are several actions that can strengthen U.S.-Mexico relations during the first 100 days of the Biden administration, including those that reemphasize the importance of Mexico as a strategic partner of the United States. In this report, we emphasize 5 in particular. First, the report recommends that President Biden make Mexico the destination of the first presidential visit of the new administration. A presidential visit is a significant symbolic act. It sends the message that the U.S. prioritizes this bilateral relationship. During the visit, President Biden could clearly acknowledge the legitimacy of Mexico's commitment to its own self-determination, while finding a middle ground on security matters, encouraging Mexico's prompt implementation of the USMCA's labor provisions, and inviting collaboration on Central American development designed to mitigate migration flows through Mexico into the United States, and of course, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, we issue we recommend that the new administration issue a bold, forward-looking statement acknowledging that the ties between the United States and Mexico are unique and inextricable, and they should emphasize the role of Mexico as a strategic partner. For 4 years, we've suffered divisive rhetoric about Mexico and Mexicans, and it's essential to publicly push the reset button on U.S. domestic political discourse about the relationship. But equally important, there needs to be a full embrace of Mexico as a strategic partner, and which will underpin future successes throughout the bilateral agenda. Third, the report emphasizes the need to make unique and profound importance of U.S.-Mexico relations clear to key officials in the Biden administration. From the State Department to Homeland Security to Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and the National Security Council, the principals in each department need to emphasize to their teams that the relationship with Mexico is uniquely important to the United States and deserving of special attention. Fourth, there's a need to establish a high-level bilateral forum to facilitate continuous communication and collaboration across different components of the relationship. While Mexico is rarely a top priority for a U.S. president, the day-to-day relationship is arguably one of the most important in the world. As such, it should be given a high priority. Equally, López Obrador is preoccupied by domestic matters, making it more challenging to promote cooperation on the bilateral agenda. So in this context, with two presidents who are preoccupied by domestic matters, a new bilateral forum composed of key officials who are occupied with the bilateral relationship, including, but also well beyond trade and security matters, can be a powerful incentive for cooperation and for re-envisioning a multifaceted bilateral relationship. Fifth and last in the area of the strategic partnership, we recommend that Biden formally invite Mexico to collaborate on the COVID-19 pandemic response. Given the number of individuals who cross our shared border daily, both with and without authorization, public health is inevitably a key priority in the relationship, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. The Biden administration should promote a counter-pandemic border strategy that includes screening, robust contact tracing and data sharing, broader regulatory alignment that would be implemented with full cooperation and partnership of the Mexican government. But building a strategic partnership will be difficult without a basic level of appreciation within the U.S. public of the importance of our relationship with Mexico. Indeed, when the U.S. public fails to understand the importance of our relationship with Mexico, when they fail to comprehend the deep integration and interdependencies between our two countries, they unsurprisingly fail to appreciate the benefits that deeper bilateral collaboration can create. In this context, with this sort of public attitude, the public puts a brake on what politicians and diplomats can achieve. Unfortunately for the bilateral relationship, U.S. perceptions of Mexico do not match reality on the ground. Americans don't equate Mexico with democracy, economic development, and the growing middle class that have characterized this country for the past quarter century, or the opportunities that might arise from it being our southern neighbor. Most Americans instead equate Mexico with poverty and violence, as well as a cool place to go on vacation. The majority of Americans also fail to appreciate the importance of Mexico in their everyday lives. From avocados to Sara Lee and Entenmann's pastries to the engines in Ford SUVs, all these things depend on our relationship with Mexico. The problematic perceptions Americans hold of Mexico thus point to an urgent need for a well-designed public diplomacy strategy to increase educational and cultural exchanges. This strategy should also be combined with an effort to bring more subnational actors into the relationship. Exchanges are proven to socialize participants to appreciate the richness and complexity of other cultures when they interact with them. While this is a long-term strategy, it will build ties over generations that will facilitate long-term bilateral integration that will help us deal effectively with a wide range of shared binational concerns. And yet the number of individuals participating in exchanges, students, teachers, technicians, security professionals, and others, is low, especially given the profound importance of our bilateral relationship. Existing educational programs, for example, like the 100,000 Strong in the Americas Initiative and the Bilateral Forum on Higher Education, Innovation, and Research, provide a strong foundation for the Biden administration to build on. That being said, education and cultural exchanges need a place on the agenda that reflects the importance of the U.S. Mexico relationship. In addition, the Biden administration should partner with mayors, governors, nonprofits, and citizen diplomats to amplify the effects of its policies toward Mexico. Local governments and U.S. civil society can serve as a bridge to allies abroad when U.S. foreign policy falls short, as was demonstrated in the past 4 years. But these same actors can now complement Washington's more active efforts by helping to both inform policy and to help carry it out. And obviously, California, Los Angeles, the Pacific Council are among the subnational actors whose work can inform and amplify Biden administration goals in Mexico. Now let me turn the floor over to Patrick Schaefer. Briefly, Patrick is the Chief Legal Counsel for Supply Chain Capital Partners, but he also serves as Senior Vice President for the Center for Global and Trade and Foreign Investment at the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. As a former professor at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, I also like to point out that he studied there. So affectionately, Patrick, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Pamela. Thanks, everybody who's been involved in this project. It's very important, as Michael said, and I think that the leadership that Pacific Council is demonstrating here will truly make a difference to both countries as we move into the future. So with respect to the structure of today's presentation, I'd like to really focus on two elements of the administration's priorities in order to flesh out some details regarding many of the points that Pamela just mentioned that Michael introduced earlier as well. I would like to look at, first of all, the priority of having a foreign policy for the middle class that's been articulated by President Biden for quite a while now. And I'd also like to articulate some aspects of what the U.S. Mexico relationship means for national security, particularly with respect to China. So, looking at the U.S. Mexico trade relationship, I think that with respect to foreign policy for the middle class and national security, it's important to first of all understand a little bit about the nature and tenor of the trading relationship that the U.S. has with Mexico. And it's evolved over many decades and in recent decades to really focus on two key industries, I would say, the automotive industry as well as natural resource industry. And this is particularly salient and timely as we hear reports coming out of Texas and Mexico and what's going on there with respect to the energy trade. And the energy trade in itself has a tremendous impact on the industrialization and the integration of the US and Mexico as well. So looking at the shift from the NAFTA to USMCA, I think it's important to recognize what the Biden administration has inherited with this new trade agreement. Some things that I would point out to begin with is that in many ways it's much different in tone from the North America Free Trade Agreement, even in the sort of symbolism of the title. The North America Free Trade Agreement has a much more aspirational, integrative tone than what we have here with the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. There were many also side agreements with NAFTA to promote more North American integration that are sort of absent here with the USMCA. The other thing that's important to think about with respect to the USMCA in itself, but also again with respect to this idea of foreign policy for the middle class in the Biden administration, is the import and emphasis on labor and organized labor. Not only does the new USMCA agreement have a chapter dedicated to labor issues, but it also has, for the first time in a free trade agreement, a real actionable mechanism to enforce labor standards under certain conditions. That's quite novel as well for a free trade agreement, certainly in the US, Mexico, and North America relationship. So it's really important to think about, as the Biden administration goes forward, this agreement and the sort of influence that organized labor has had and will have with the mechanisms under the USMCA. In fact, it has been stated recently that certain organized labor groups are even preparing to file certain claims under the rapid response labor enforcement mechanism of the USMCA. So that's something I think that we should keep an eye out for, that will be of concern not only for the Biden administration, but also for organized labor throughout the United States. The other thing I want to mention about foreign policy for the middle class with respect to the US-Mexico trading relationship is the opportunity to really find complementary sectors between the two countries and then further work across regions. So this isn't necessarily just a question of foreign direct investment of industrial clusters, but also something I'd really like to point out before I go too much further that Pamela mentioned about exchanges, about the type and the nature of Mexicans coming to the United States and even of US citizens going to Mexico. And for example, data I'll show in a minute really highlights how much professional visas have gone to people from India and China with respect to Mexico, who have received far fewer professional level visas than those countries. So it's important to think about, when we are considering trade, foreign policy for the middle class, really building a robust economy together, the importance that educational exchange and also professional exchange will have for this relationship. The other thing I'd like to mention is about sort of the regional importance of this trading relationship. And here we can look to Los Angeles for a moment. Los Angeles, in many ways, is really oriented towards maritime trade, obviously. The two ports, Port of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles, are some of the world's biggest ports. But the trade with Mexico, in many ways, is dominated by overland trade across the U.S. Mexico border. San Isidro, San Diego, Nogales, El Paso, and Laredo. And in a minute, we can take a look at what kind of goods have been coming through in order to understand better the role that Los Angeles will play. So in many ways, Los Angeles serves as a conduit for goods in recent years coming from China and going into the North American supply chain. These have been particularly dominated by mechanical and electronic goods in recent years. And I'd like to take a minute to show you a slide that I think is worthy of, oh, we can't show the slides. Well, at any rate, I can tell you that in recent years, foreign exports from U.S. Mexico customs districts have increased substantially. For example, 53% of all exports by value coming out of El Paso into Mexico are of a foreign origin. And particularly, these exports are dominated by, as I said, not just machinery, but also particularly electronic goods. So what we're seeing in recent years with respect to this U.S.-Mexico trading relationship is a greater and greater integration of electronics that come from Asia, particularly China. And they make their way through the Pacific ports, in this case, Los Angeles, and head over to the overland border customs districts and get integrated into these supply chains. I think it's no surprise for any of us that when we get in a car nowadays, how dominated it is and how dominated we are even driving by electronics, screens, switches, computers, cables, etc. So this is something also that's not just important to consider from a regional integration perspective or the opportunity for regional actors to become involved in the Biden administration's policy of creating a foreign policy for the middle class, especially with respect to the U.S.-Mexico trading relationship. But it also really shows, the influence of China on the U.S.-Mexico trading relationship and how that even affected the USMCA. The USMCA, in addition to having these new chapters on labor and mechanisms for the enforcement of labor agreements, but also the rules of origin with respect to the automotive industry. And over years, as I was just mentioning, as electronics have become more integrated into all kinds of goods, particularly automotive goods, this has meant that China has been allowed to sort of free ride with respect to the rules of origin of automotive parts going back and forth across the border, tariff-free with the US and Mexico. So, what this means then for places like Los Angeles or other places along the US-Mexico border, I-10 or the Union Pacific route, is to think about how to build complementary or regionally centered industrial sectors that can help sort of augment or offset a lot of these imports that come from China. Which then sort of brings me to the final point that I wanted to say about how the US-Mexico relationship can not just be beneficial and can help further the administration's commitment to a foreign policy for the middle class, but can also help to serve as a countervailing weight to Chinese growth and influence, not only economically and in terms of trade, but also in terms of national security. Because as Michael was saying earlier in the beginning, the US-Mexico relationship is a holistic relationship. It's not just a relationship of goods or of services. It's a relationship of neighbors, of families. It's a relationship that is deeply rooted and deeply integrated for many, 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 many years. So as we're thinking about how to counteract China's growing influence, particularly in the Pacific, we should really think about how to better integrate with Mexico. Again, not only for the narrow and at some times hermetically viewed issues such as security, energy, education, environment, et cetera, but from a holistic manner. So in this case, the more that we can do to integrate with Mexico, whether it's with supply chains and industrial clusters, or even places like energy. As we saw in the news recently, the governor of Texas has restricted natural gas exports to Mexico. Now, it's important to remember that Mexico relies in great measure on energy inputs from the United States, whether that's with respect to natural gas for electricity generation or with refined fuel for cars and trucks and other automotive use. They really depend on the United States. But that dependence doesn't just matter for Mexico as a whole. It also matters, again, for this trading relationship, because if electricity rates are very high in Mexico, if there's a scarcity of fuel, that will also hurt US businesses and US consumers, and it will further deteriorate the US-Mexico relationship, making the US weaker and the North American relationship weaker vis-a-vis other actors like China. So all this is to really say and conclude that with respect to the administration's emphasis on finding a foreign policy for the middle class, and with the administration's work to make North America more secure and the United States more secure vis-a-vis other kinds of global and emerging threats, we really should think about the role of the US-Mexico relationship. We should think about the role of trade with the US-Mexico relationship. And we should also finally think about the role of places like Los Angeles, Southern California, the trade routes that it has at its disposal in order to facilitate these administration goals and these goals of national importance.
We'll now open the floor to questions. You can submit your question through the Q&A box. Our first question comes from Jerry Grain. Mexico needs Biden cabinet support and engagement across the board, not just the Secretary of State or Homeland Security. Does his cabinet have people with Mexico experience and interests? If so, who, and who will our next ambassador be?
I'm happy to give that a shot. First of all, I think anytime you're going to talk about the Biden administration's orientation toward Latin America and specifically toward Mexico, you have to begin with the president himself. And President Biden has been to Mexico numerous times. He has a very long-standing history with the region and with the country, both in terms of his time in the Senate as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, but also as vice president for President Obama. I recall when I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce and we launched the high-level economic dialogue with Mexico, which elevated the U.S.-Mexico relationship to a strategic discussion, a strategic dialogue about competitiveness. It was the vice president, then Vice President Biden, who chaired that and traveled to host and chair that commission, that dialogue in Mexico. So there's a deep expertise beginning with the president himself. Second, in the cabinet and around the president, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who was then his national security advisor when he was vice president, was very involved in those efforts and in that work. And I recall fondly working with Jake and having his support on those U.S.-Mexico issues. Similarly, Secretary of State Tony Blinken has a deep understanding and appreciation of the relationship and was involved in his role at one time as Deputy National Security Advisor and as Deputy Secretary of State. Of course, Secretary Mayorkas himself coming from Los Angeles as former U.S. Attorney and as a former Deputy of Homeland Security, has that expertise. And I've had the privilege, Allie's a former law partner of mine, I've had the privilege of talking to Allie privately quite extensively about the importance of the border, not just from a security standpoint, but from a holistic economic and competitiveness standpoint. And I think Allie, or Secretary Mayorkas, really gets that. Also in the White House, by the way, I should mention that former Ambassador Roberta Jacobson is there in her role with a specific emphasis on the border. And Catherine Tai, the new U.S. Trade Representative, was the chief negotiator in the Ways and Means Committee, I believe, when USMCA was being negotiated, and she has a deep understanding of, from a Democratic perspective, I think, of these issues. What's open is whether that expertise will transfer over to the subcabinet and, of course, over to the Department of Commerce. I'm not personally familiar with Governor Raimundo's connectivity to Mexico. She comes from a smaller New England state, so there'll be some opportunities to educate and promote there as well. And similarly, DOJ plays a huge role, and I don't know if Judge Garland has that experience, so we'll have to look and see who else is appointed at the subcabinet level. As for the ambassadorship, I'm not one to speculate who it'll be. I'll tell you the Vegas money is betting on former Senator Ken Salazar as a strong candidate. He was a former co-chair of the campaign, a former senator with Biden in the Senate, and of course a member of the Obama-Biden cabinet back in the day. And I'm told through the grapevine that the senator is interested and is a strong candidate. I think the senator would be a fine representative of the United States there, and I think I'm not personally familiar with how deeply experienced he is with the relationship or the topic, but there are a number of names that have been circulated. My understanding is that Senator Salazar may be a strong candidate. But I want to make a more broad point, because whoever gets that job, we have to understand, and I think to try to just mix the conversation up a little bit here beyond the possibilities, I think the reality is we should be very sober in recognizing, notwithstanding the opportunities that Pamela alluded to, that we are seeing a very difficult moment in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And under President Lopez Obrador, we've seen something of a backsliding in the quality of the relationship with Mexico. We've seen a diminishment in the rule of law. We've seen a weakening of democratic institutions accompanied by a centralization of power under the presidency in Mexico. We've seen further attacks on free press, much like we saw here in the United States with Donald Trump's assailing the so-called fake press or fake media. We have seen a rise of nationalism and a return to some pre-NAFTA mentality and attacks on the private sector, antagonism of the private sector, and a promotion of Mexican state-owned enterprises like Pemex and CFE, the electricity entity, to the detriment of Mexico's own, I think, national interest, and certainly to the detriment of U.S.-Mexico bilateral cooperation. So whoever the new ambassador is going to be, and this is putting aside the security issues, the Cienfuegos issue, the constant issues that are always on the table, whoever the new ambassador is going to be is going to have a very challenging assignment. He or she is going to have to understand how to challenge and hold Mexico accountable, and to do it in a way that's effective privately, more than publicly, but also leverage the platform of the ambassadorship to promote American values and to promote a vision of North America that we need to see. I am deeply disappointed that I don't think the AMLO administration has embraced in any way, shape, or form a vision or a commitment to North America that is anything like what we had hoped for in prior years. And now that we have pro-North American leaders in Canada and the United States, the question is going to be is whether we can leverage our diplomatic tools to bring Mexico along kicking and screaming.
Our next question is from an anonymous attendee, asking as if I am the Secretary of State, how should I consider staffing our Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs based on your recommendations? Should I create any particular new positions?
Patrick, you were just on the Biden transition team, the agency review team. How would you take that?
Sure. I think that there's something always very important for federal agencies to cooperate more fully. And I think Michael was alluding to this just a few minutes ago. It's really important for the State Department to view the Department of Commerce in general, and I think the U.S. Mexico trading relationship as something that can really further national security interests, and not viewing just the U.S. Mexico relationship from a narrow security or national security lens. So I think that it's always important for the State Department in particular to really understand the role of the USTR and the role of the Department of Commerce and its particular agencies, not just International Trade Administration, but others, to really advance a U.S. interest. I think that also the designation of Ambassador Jacobson as the person in charge of the border is something very important. She has a longstanding personal and professional experience with the region, particularly with Mexico. So I think that's going to really help the State Department better understand the entirety and the holistic nature of the U.S.-Mexico border relationship as it relates to two countries in general. But I think that from my experience, it's very important for the State Department to view the trade relationships, the commercial relationships, as part and parcel of a U.S.-Mexico security relationship.
I would just add to that specifically to say there's a handful of key appointments at the State Department that the Secretary would need to take account of. My first advice to Secretary Blinken would be to make sure you fill the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere and the Undersecretary of State for economic and environmental affairs and energy affairs, I think it is, with people who are deeply experienced in the region and aren't going to need to learn on the job. We're at such a critical point. We really can't afford for novices to come in and sort of be, have on the job training. But as for new positions, I would recommend actually, and I'm somewhat sorry we didn't recommend it in the actual report, but that if not the president, the Secretary of State, consider naming a special envoy, much like we have for climate change, a special envoy for North America, somebody who has specific responsibilities to ensure that North America and strategy for North America is a major part of our foreign policy, specifically in response to the Chinese challenge. China is going to define Biden's foreign policy agenda. There's no question about it. And he's going to have a muscular response to it. And in my view, the only way we're going to compete against China directly over time, over the long haul, taking a Chinese view of things, is as a region, as North America. And we need to, the difficulty in the U.S. interagency is that we have a bunch of fiefdoms and siloed agencies. And it's very hard, even sometimes for the National Security Council, to cut across the agencies and bring forward a strong vision and a strong leadership. And I think the issue of North American competitiveness merits its own centralized, focused attention because it has implications for climate change. It has implications for the COVID response. It has implications for just global competitiveness, not just vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis the European Union and other trading partners. And I think that having somebody like that strongly advocating for a competitive North America that has the power to cut across the interagency and drive an agenda on behalf of the president would be critical. So I would advise the Secretary Blinken consider someone of that stature at that level, if not appointed by the Secretary of State, if not appointed by the president. And that's different than an ambassador to Mexico, because the ambassador to Mexico is on the ground and has very specific assignments on the ground vis-a-vis Mexico. This is a cross-cutting interagency role with leadership at the highest levels.
Our next question is from Alex Albin. We haven't mentioned immigration reform on the US side. What kind of immigration measures would Mexico like to see the US adopt in the next 4 years?
Let me start on that one. I think we always have to keep in mind something about the Mexican administration. This administration is uniquely focused on Mexican domestic affairs. They have a domestic agenda, and what López Obrador most wants is foreign affairs to not get in the way of the domestic affairs. So he doesn't really have a well-developed agenda in terms of what he wants from the United States in terms of treatment of Mexican nationals in the United States, Mexicans coming across the border. What he wants is for there to be jobs for Mexicans in the United States so they can send remittances home. He's very focused on remittances. And he also, an area where there could be a collaboration, close collaboration between the United States and Mexico, is he's very interested in helping the United States reduce the flow of Central Americans through Mexico toward the United States. Mexican citizens aren't happy about Central Americans in their country any more than Americans are happy about having Central Americans. So he has a domestic motivation for that. They also he would want to work, we want to see and a plan from the Biden administration to begin the process of beginning economic and political development in Central America that might mitigate the flow of Central Americans toward the United States. But this Mexican government is not going to opine about US immigration reform, thinking that that is US domestic policy. And if Mexico opines about US domestic policy, it gives the United States grounds to opine about Mexican domestic policy, which López Obrador absolutely does not want.
Thank you, Pamela. Our next question is for Patrick. Patrick, you said NAFTA was more aspirational compared to USMCA. Do you believe NAFTA had unachievable goals?
Well, I think integration is an ideal. whether integration is ever fully achieved, I think it's really something that we have to continue to work on. I think that the tone and tenor of trading relationships internationally have been changing since NAFTA was signed and entered into force. And I think this is important for the new administration to consider. And I think it really, points to a couple of the things that Michael was just talking about. The whole trading relationship has changed, really not just since NAFTA entered into force, but since China joined the WTO. And it has disrupted trade relationships across the world and has further then disrupted even economic constituencies within the US and with all of the countries that are part of the global trading system. So I think that back in the early 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, at the end of the Cold War, there was a enthusiasm for what could be achieved with certain political and economic ideals. It has brought us to a point where maybe those ideals NAFTA wasn't able to fulfill. But I think that nevertheless, integration, collaboration is critical for a personal existence and a shared existence. So I think that the points that Michael and Pamela are making with respect to the United States, Mexico in particular, and the role of the administration, it's really incumbent upon us to build and add a kind of renewed enthusiasm for this kind of integration, even if it's not written into the USMCA or so thematically present. I think it's incumbent upon us as citizens to work towards that goal.
Our next question, what will it take to get the U.S.-Mexico security relationship back on track?
Let me start with that one. I think that at the end of the day, what both countries want is a security relationship that works. I think it is quite important that López Obrador made the effort to blame the whole Cienfuegos fiasco on the Trump administration and to say that he wanted to have a decent working relationship going forward with Biden. Mexico also passed a law in December, which I mentioned, which just makes it very complicated for US security personnel to operate on the ground in Mexico. When it was actually published in the official Gazette, which is the equivalent of the president signing the law, it had been walked back a good bit. So I think those are signs that López Obrador is sending the United States that they want to work together. That being said, I'm going to echo what Michael just said, is the best way to approach Mexico to get things done is to do so quietly, behind closed doors, and to treat Mexico as a full partner in the process. The thing about the Cienfuegos arrest that Mexico most resented is that it was never informed about the investigation and was blindsided by the arrest. And it feels personally that there was no evidence under which the general should have been arrested in the first place. So they feel very aggrieved toward the United States. So there's going to need to be some effort on the United States to meet Mexico in a middle ground. And I think we'll be able to reconstruct a decent working relationship, but it's López Obrador, so it's never going to be as close and as collaborative as it was particularly under the Calderon administration, for example.
I think the key also, Pamela, as you were alluding to, is building off of the private diplomacy point. I think the United States has to have some humility in how we approach Mexico and some recognition that sometimes some U.S. administrations take the view that, Mexico's what's the right word, sort of a satellite of the United States, or, sort of a second tier country that we can dictate to. The reality is it's a sovereign nation, and it has a president that was democratically elected and is fully in power. And I think the United States has to recognize that we have to have some humility in our approach, in our dealings, and reassure Mexico that we have full and complete respect for its sovereignty. And whatever we do, it has to be done with them as a partner with full respect for their sovereignty. And then I would say, hold them accountable. So it's, you can't where there's a tendency to sort of want to hold Mexico accountable and point fingers at them without really conveying a full respect and inviting them to the table in a full way. I believe both are necessary. And I also believe the accountability piece is very important.
Our next question is from Bob Lutz. Educational exchanges between the U.S. and Mexico, once thriving, have been significantly affected by the widespread criminality in Mexico. Is there any way to reverse this situation?
Speaking as somebody who does exchange programs in Mexico, it has become more complicated. Students' parents are afraid of having their children go to Mexico. And I think there are two core solutions. One is on the ground, where Mexico needs to get more serious about fighting violent crime than it has been. This government has not prioritized it the way that it really needs to. And we also have to use a reinvigorated bilateral security relationship to work on that front. But also the perceptions of violence in Mexico on the part of Americans is much worse than the actual situation on the ground. And so I think there needs to be a lot of work on the part of US officials and civil society as well in informing the American public about what the reality is on the ground in Mexico, so that there isn't a sense of it's worse than it really is. Mexico has problems with crime, but so does Detroit and New Orleans. So, and I choose those two cities because they're comparable.
Thank you. Our final question comes from the Mexican consulate. How is the vaccine diplomacy going to impact the Mexico-China relationship, and how does that impact the U.S.-Mexico one?
Go backs. I would just offer that first of all, I would hope that, and I don't mean this to sound naive or Pollyannish, if China has an effective vaccine that can help the world, we should be encouraging its distribution and thanking the Chinese for making it available. But the reality is there's a lot of skepticism out there about products from China, especially in this space. Pamela, you may have more recent insights than I on the way the Chinese vaccines are being received in China. But my own view is that this is not a big issue in the bilateral relationship. I don't see it as having the kind of weight or currency that's going to change much of anything. As I say, my own view is that if they have an effective vaccine, Mexico's in such dire circumstances that any help they can get, they should be encouraged to receive, and we should be appreciative of China. And I frankly think that the United States should be doing more, not only to vaccinate its own millions of citizens that live in Mexico, but also have a comprehensive border strategy vis-a-vis vaccine rollout that encompasses, that works with Mexico to provide comprehensive vaccines across both sides of the border, because the border is so seamless. It is so permeable. And there's so much cross-border traffic, not just in trade, but people daily crossing the border back and forth. It's insane not to have a coordinated strategy. But I don't think this is one that needs or should be politicized in the context of the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that Mexico did just receive 200,000 vaccines from China, but this was their first shipment of significant size. And they have asked for vaccines from the United States. The United States doesn't feel it has sufficient quantity to share with Mexico at this point. So that is definitely points in China's favor, and certainly is going to be well received by the Mexican government. That being said, it wasn't anywhere near the number of vaccines that Mexico had hoped to receive from China. So I think that while China is hoping that vaccine diplomacy will have a significant impact globally in its image as a benefactor country, in Latin America to date, it hasn't been as aggressive as it has been in other parts of the world. And in Mexico, it's just beginning. And I don't see where it's going to have as big of an impact as China would hope it might have. And then I would echo what Michael's saying, is that by going down that road of asking whose impact is greater, it's politicizing an issue that needs to be depoliticized so we can effectively deal with it.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any final concluding remarks they'd like to share? Thank you all so much for joining us today.
I want to thank the panelists, Patrick and Pamela, for your contributions and for your contribution to the report. The Mexico Initiative Advisory Board is very grateful for the work that you've done. And Ashley and Nastasha and the staff at the Pacific Council, thank you for your leadership in moving this agenda forward.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michael.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.